Susan is the bureau chief for USA Today. She has covered 11, I believe, campaigns, and is now on her 7th presidency. She is also the author of 2 New York Times bestselling biographies, Madam Speaker about Nancy Pelosi and The Matriarch about Barbara Bush. And her next one is about Barbara Walters, and we do not know the title yet, so we'll have to wait for that. But Susan, thank you so much for being here. She has obviously decades of experience for you all to draw on, and we're very excited to have you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be here with you. Anne is a really outstanding editor. We were so sorry when she left us to join this program, but of course it's an excellent program, and congratulations to all of you for being part of it. Everybody in Washington journalism knows about the Paul Miller Fellows, and the alumni are a pretty remarkable group of journalists too. So I'm sure that this is going to be a really valuable experience for you. You are all obviously really smart in another way, in that you're interested in journalism, which is the most fun you can possibly do in a lifetime of careers. And your timing is like, whether you did this deliberately or I suspect accidentally, your timing is good too, because we had starting about 2008, about a decade of layoffs and contraction. And now, as a result of all that churn, we just see huge opportunities for younger journalists to get started in the career, and also an explosion of different platforms and experimentation with business models to pay for the journalism that we want to do. So I think it is a really promising time to be getting into journalism. It also seems to me it's a really important time to be a journalist. And the turmoil of the Trump presidency, with the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, was a sort of reminder of the fragility of our democracy and the role that journalism has to play if we're going to have a healthy democracy that's going to be sustained. So I think that all of us feel an enhanced sense of mission, the mission of journalists that go back to the days of the founders. Obviously, time of big challenges as well, not just the financial ones, but also the erosion of public trust in the news media. This is very troubling. It's something that I think every one of us has an obligation to try to address and rebuild. I do not have a big speech. I told Anne that in that USA Today, maybe I would give like 3 things you should do, my 3 pieces of advice for journalism. And so I actually came up with 4. So these are the 4 things I've learned in doing journalism. 1, show up. You can't cover stuff off a live stream, off the TV, or off your phone, or by texting. There's no comparison to showing up and seeing an event with your own eyes. When you do things remotely, you can get the story that you thought you were going to get, but when you go out and show up, you get the story you didn't know existed. And it's always also a great way to do the number 2 tip, which is it's all about sources. Your good journalism depends on building and sustaining sources who trust you and who you trust. And after all these years in journalism, I've concluded there's only about 3 dozen people in the world, because you keep running into the same ones. So the source that you have on a story you do tomorrow could well be a source that you will be depending on 10 or 20 years from now. And that goes to the value of developing deep, trusting source relationships wherever you go and whatever you're doing. My 3rd shrewd tip is to accept that there are shades of gray. Things are not black and white. If you write a story with a hero and a villain, you might want to take a second look at it. If you write a story where you're conveying that you know exactly what happened and what's going to happen next, that's probably wrong. Reality is complicated and messy, and smart journalism has to reflect that. And my last tip is to not assume. This is a lesson I've had to learn myself over and over again. Most recently in 2016, when like the rest of the political ecosystem, I assumed that Donald Trump could not be elected president. And all of us turned out to be wrong. And it was a mistake that we should not have made then. And I'm endeavoring to try to not make it again. So those are the 4 things I've learned, but I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about journalism, or about getting a job, or about keeping a job, or getting ahead, or about doing an interview, or about balancing personal life with a work life, or whatever you would like to talk about that I might be able to have something to say. Or if you have something to say to me, I would be delighted to hear it. And in the spirit of my USA Today, I would like the first question to come from Matt Brown, who was not previously warned that he was going to be called on to do this. But Matt, you are responsible nonetheless for coming up with a really smart question now.
Okay, wonderful. I was wondering, like, okay, so I'm a Paul Miller Fellow today, your colleague again next week. But Susan, I guess I would be very interested to hear your thoughts, particularly as you mentioned, just declining trust in journalism. What to do in your view about, in this new ecosystem we're coming up with, misinformation in particular, and how news outlets that are venturing to sift through the ecosystem that we're coming into with media are trying to become arbiters of what's true or what's false. How can we become better guides? And what does that actually look like in an environment where just in a Twitter feed, you can scroll through and you might have one post from USA Today with an article, but then the next post could be from XYZ outlet that might not have the same editorial standards or hold itself to the same journalistic values.
So it's a great question for which there is not really a simple answer. The erosion of trust in journalism has been mirrored by erosion of trust in government, and in big labor, and in big business, and in academia, and in the church. So there has been a broad scale, I think, deterioration in our society of trust in big institutions, including the news media. And some of that is our doing. I think that when we do coverage that is elitist or inaccurate or dismissive, that it prompts our readers and viewers and listeners to dismiss us. So I think we rebuild trust in the work that we do brick by brick, just like it was eroded brick by brick. It's going to be rebuilt brick by brick. And we do that by doing coverage that is carefully accurate. If you're doing a fact check, please do not get a fact wrong. It's a big problem. So careful to be accurate, careful to be fair, careful to listen and be willing to listen to points of view that you think are wrong or misguided or whatever. If we're going to reach the people who have the least trust in the news media, we need to convince them that we are listening to them. And those are the people who are perhaps most likely to believe the misinformation we're trying to correct. So it's like one step at a time, but we have no bigger obligation than that. So Matt, let me ask you, what do you think? Do you have any thoughts on what we can do to try to, rebuild the trust that people can read our coverage and think it's correct, whatever their political perspective? Do you have any thoughts on what would help?
I would say my only thought at the moment is that oftentimes I think that journalists just have to meet people where they are. As you were talking about inside, a lot of times journalists, we can all be reading each other's coverage and thinking about what each other's thinking, but that might not necessarily be what the people who are trying to serve are thinking. And I'm coming into this year, I personally at least have been very, very preoccupied with thinking about, okay, I want to be able to do coverage. And I think this might, I'm just going to speak for myself here, but this might apply to other people in the group, but thinking about wanting to be able to do coverage that people here in DC, as we all grow as DC reporters, can really appreciate, really like. But then we all work for outlets that have websites on the internet that our stories are going to be able to be read or be able to be accessed by anyone in the world, and definitely in the country. And I'm just thinking about what are ways that we can make sure that we're actually making useful, informative content for people that is accessible, and when it's proper, relatable. And that's a concern that I've personally been thinking about and would love to hear any more of your thoughts on, because I think that that's the only way that meeting regular everyday Americans where they are is the only way that I can think of as a step one to get back to a place of trust with the media.
Yeah. And of course, Donald Trump didn't create this phenomenon, but he recognized it and tapped it in a very shrewd way, the resentment of the news media, the distrust of the news media. I was born and raised in Kansas, and the attitudes, the default attitudes but my first job was in New York, and then I came down to Washington, and the attitudes of New Yorkers toward people from Kansas was shocking to me. I remember a Time story. This is actually a notorious Time story from, God, it must be 20 years ago, where they characterized evangelical Christians as easily led. Well, a lot of the people in Kansas are evangelical Christians, and some of them are easily led maybe, but many of them are not. And it's not really a characteristic of the demographic group. And when you have that attitude in your coverage and it comes across in your stories, how in the world do you expect evangelical Christians to believe anything else that you write? And I think that was, I think we should have listened. And I wish I had listened harder in 2016 to what I was hearing from the voters I was interviewing, to recognize just how deep that distrust was going. So I totally agree that step one is meeting readers and in their own lives and treating them with respect. Unless somebody is like indicted for murder, or I really think even if somebody you think is pretty misguided, it's important for us to treat them with respect, not to repeat misinformation, but not to act like we have an answer and how stupid you are to think something different. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this particular topic? Because it is, I think, as important as anything else we could discuss.
Yeah, I'm curious about this in particular because it's one thing for our institution, obviously we have to have standards and all those things, I'm on board with all that, but there's this other thing where we're in this new era of how politicians navigate this space and the ways that they're communicating and they're leaning into it. I cover Kansas, so Roger Marshall is a good example of this. He was just on Steve Bannon's podcast and said Fauci is part of the deep state, and so when you have these politicians who are leaning into this thing, how do we navigate it, particularly when they're just, the rules of engagement have completely changed. I went from covering Mitch McConnell to Josh Hawley, and it's night and day how the professionalism has shifted and how Hawley's staff's professionalism is nowhere near where McConnell's staff was. And I'm just kind of curious, I don't have a great question here, but how are you navigating this new era where there seems like there are no longer rules of decorum and all things are almost treated as acceptable?
Yeah, or a father can make a Christmas call to NASA and use a vulgarity to talk to the president of the United States. In what world does that happen? And then him not be apologetic. In fact, now I think he's thinking about running for office. Are you working for a Kansas outlet?
The Kansas City Star.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, my first internship was at the Wichita Eagle. So anyway,
I cover them too.
Yeah. So when Marshall got into that exchange with Fauci, did you write about it?
Yes, that's the other demand is, your editors still want the story that says Dr. Fauci called Roger Marshall a moron, right? And so we did do a follow-up story about open records law and how, he's manipulating what a public record is. But usually the follow-up story doesn't get as much attention as the moron headline,
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we should not cover things that happen, right? It's news that he got in that exchange, and it's some of the other comments that Marshall has made. You gotta cover. I don't know what to do about kind of the incivility of where we are. Everything, it's like everything is uncivil. When it snowed like 2 weeks ago, one of my neighbors posted on Twitter that I hadn't shoveled my walk, and why wasn't I shoveling my walk? which was like, and in a slightly menacing way. And I thought, really, you couldn't have like, number one, I did shovel my walk. I just waited a couple hours. And number two, you couldn't have like knocked on the door, or maybe you could have shoveled my walk for me, Guy, if it means so much to you. I think we got to cover what's there. I think we try to not always treat it like, I don't think the story about the phone call that Biden took at NASA should be treated as a funny story. I think it should be written as a sobering story, right? I mean, I wouldn't have written that as a bright, but as something pretty serious. All I know to do is to treat people with respect and civility, and hope that this gradually catches on. And COVID has made everything worse, and it's made everybody mad, and it makes it weird to get on a plane or go to the grocery store because everyone is in such a rage. But I think it's also made some people try very hard to not do that, on the theory that we're all in this together. So I'm hoping, maybe green shoots in terms of returning some civility. It is, one thing is, it's more civil now than it was when Trump was president, because Trump set a standard that we had never seen before. So whatever the shortcomings of the Biden administration, he has, I think, tried very hard to lower the temperature and to generally avoid some of the, ad hominem attacks that President Trump is known for.
We have a question from Candice.
Hey, hi, thank you so much for joining us. I mainly, just to add to this conversation about trust in media, I feel like we tend to think about this more of like misinformation or mistrust from a white conservative space. And I've been thinking more about, in my publication, thinks really about building trust within communities that have been historically unrepresented, historically marginalized. And I feel like a big part of that starts within the newsroom itself. I mean, their diversity, well, I don't know. Actually, I was like, a diversity is growing, but I don't know all the time, because some publications aren't great about kind of releasing that information. But I see more people from more diverse backgrounds, particularly like people of color, getting to cover the White House and all of these higher up institutions, which is great. But having the numbers, right, is not really the same as supporting them in a way where their expertise, their lived experiences can be used to kind of highlight the nuances of conversations that are going on in these different communities. And so I think a big part of that is, of building that trust within these communities is, finding ways of really supporting and I don't know what the word, I was trying to use something cliche, not cliche like empowering, but really using the expertise of those lived experiences to inform a better, more well-rounded coverage. So,
Yeah. Well, I think we're paying more attention to diversity now, and not perfectly delivering. I mean, speaking for the entire industry, not perfectly delivering, but definitely more appreciation for the importance of having people of color, women, lesbians and gays, transgender people. I mean, I think that we have an appreciation now of the importance of having them reporting the news and making decisions about the news that wasn't there. I mean, really, a generation ago. That's been a pretty rapid change. Can I ask you, what outlet are you working for?
Yeah, I work for the 19th News.
So the 19th has been a great example of that, right? Because that's, what is that, like 2 or 3 years old now?
Yeah, right. We started 2020. Yeah.
Yeah, and you wouldn't have, and it gets a lot of attention because it does good journalism, and it reflects a different economic model than the traditional model. And it's had a big impact, so that reporters from the 19th are recognized across town. So it's not like things get fixed immediately. This is definitely not fixed, but I do feel like there have been really significant changes. And I've been disappointed that, there was a group that did counts on diversity in newsrooms. I don't remember what it was. And USA Today responded. We responded to their request for counts in the past, but most newsrooms wouldn't provide the data to do the analysis of where things stood, which I assume is because the numbers weren't very good and they didn't want to release them. But I think that's, I think it's important to have a metric to look at. And I agree that that the ranks of reporters are now more diverse than the ranks of publishers, right? So that needs to happen. That needs to happen as well. Have you felt like have you felt treated respectfully yourself?
I mean, at the 19th, for sure. Not always. And, I've graduated grad school in 2016. So I've hopped around some different places. So, and it's not like I have been fortunate. I haven't felt any egregious sort of what I would classify as egregious discrimination, but just seeing the ways that certain editors will interact with other people who look like them or not offer the same sort of guidance or mentorship to me, that's been something I felt for sure.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something we have to like consciously pay attention to, right? Because the easiest thing in the world is to build a relationship with someone. The easiest thing in the world for me would be to build a relationship with a white woman from Kansas. Not that there are that many around in Washington, but you need to consciously not do that. Or you need to consciously go beyond that. And I think again, we've got a long way to go as a culture. I do feel like we're heading in the right direction, and that in the wake of George Floyd's murder, I think that it accelerated attention to a whole range of issues beyond police misconduct. So I'm not satisfied, but hopeful. And I hope your experiences in places that are, I mean, the 19th is kind of designed to be a diverse workplace, right? But I hope your experience or the experience of other people in just newsrooms that are just, standard issue, broad scope, not specialized, not that are not maybe quite like the 19th, more like the newsroom I work in, are paying attention to this. I wonder if anybody else here has felt like you've been treated disrespectfully where you work. I wonder if you found that to be a problem, or if you haven't found that to be a problem.
I've run into a little bit of income or socioeconomic background bias at audio conference that I used to go to. I started my career in as a public radio contributor for a very local small show in Pittsburgh, and had the opportunity to go to larger conferences. And I have found some difficulty navigating coming from like a lower socioeconomic background. So I will say that I don't know if that contributes to the conversation, but
actually, I think that's so interesting. And like, what would happen?
Upon describing my background, just the comments that I would get, or I can't fault people for maybe looks of surprise. I was the first person to go to college. I come from, just blue collar, waitresses, dry cleaners background. And so navigating, meeting people and then meeting me from, just different backgrounds. I have felt a bit of judgment sometimes in comments that come my way, like, oh, wow, I'm surprised you. I think one of the comments at the audio conference, wow, what a strange background. I'm surprised you made it, or something like that. So that's, I don't know if that contributes to this conversation, but it's an experience that I've had.
Well, I would just say that what a huge asset to have when you're out on the road talking to people, right? If you go up to, if you're out doing a campaign rally someplace and you're wearing a Harvard sweatshirt, nobody's going to want to talk to you. But if you go up and you talk to somebody and they say, I'm a waitress, and you say, oh God, my mom was a waitress, blah, blah, it's like, not only does it give you a way to connect, it means you actually understand their lives in a way that the guy with the Harvard sweatshirt won't, or probably doesn't. Not everybody from Harvard, but many. Any Harvard grads here? No, we'll leave that alone. Anybody else that feel like it's a struggle in the newsroom? Or is your experience pretty good?
Yeah, I think relatedly, I didn't go to a J school, and I feel like moving to DC and even being in the journalism industry, not going to Columbia, Northwestern, Mizzou, NYU, like they're phenomenal schools for good reasons. They really train you well. I've heard great things about their programs, all resources I never had access to, barely even having a journalism emphasis attached to my degree. So that has frequently made me feel like I'm behind, but then also going into big newsrooms like where I'm at now, I feel like half the people went to Northwestern, and it, I've had editors be like, oh yeah, we usually don't pick from other schools because we don't have the time to train students as interns, or we don't have the time to walk students through like X, Y, and Z, which is what internships are supposed to be for. So I guess kind of echoing some of what Ashley was saying, really honing in on socioeconomic diversity, but also geographic diversity as well, focusing on hiring people who are from state schools or not J school backgrounds. For me specifically, like being Latina in Idaho is 100% different than being Latina in Florida or in New York or in Nebraska. And having that specific like intersection, allows me to relate to people in different ways that, just hiring a Latina from anywhere is not necessarily gonna do the job, right? I cover agriculture, and so I talk to people out in rural communities. I talk to farmers all the time. They don't always like big city DC calling them up, but then I call them from my 208 number, and the attitude like instantly changes. So, having that focus on diversity, I think, is really, really important, even regardless of race, right? Like a white male from Idaho is going to be completely different than a white male who grew up in New York City. And that really matters. And I think that's a cornerstone for building up trust in these communities. The thing that has surprised me a lot about moving to DC is how remorseful everyone is about how they treated the 2016 election. Like, man, there is so much regret out here over that. And, a lot of people outside of DC would have been like, man, I kind of saw this one coming a little bit. And maybe if we had some more of that geographic diversity and a little bit more of that belief and trust in outside the Beltway, outside of the East Coast and LA, then we would build that trust back up a little bit and have better newsrooms and better journalism altogether.
Yeah, I totally agree. Who are you working for now?
Politico.
For Politico, famous for its rural coverage. It's, I mean, the focus. Politico does great stuff, and is doing more and more straight, but kind of known for its inside Washington thing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I'm aware.
Let me speak as a graduate of both Northwestern and Columbia.
And again, they're great programs.
Yeah,
I just didn't go there.
I think it was a big help in getting my first job. In fact, I got my first job because a professor I had at Columbia hired me to go to Newsday. So I do think there's an advantage to being in one of those established schools where there are alums all around and it's helpful. But I do think that by the time of your second job, nobody cares. Like by then, they're not judging you by where you went to school. They're judging you by the work you have done. And by the time you're in your third job or after a decade, no one will even know where it's just so completely irrelevant. And one thing I like about journalism is that you can definitely have an advantage or not advantage at that first step, but you get a little further along and it's a meritocracy. It's, are you delivering? Have you broken stories? Can you write well? Do you speak fluently enough to do a video or to be on TV or to talk on the radio? It's really what you do, but I think it's true. I think there is this edge for people who went to that handful of schools. But just remember, if you pretty soon it won't matter. And no degree is going to save you if you're the people who went to Northwestern Columbia or Mizzou, no degree is going to save you if you turn out to be incompetent.
That's very true.
I want to go to the folks who have their hand raised in a second, but I did just want to go back to Candice's point and not to tout our own stuff too much, but that's exactly why we created the Widening the Pipeline Fellowship. It's because we need to get journalists of colors, not just at one level, but make sure that they do move on to be the editors in chief, the publishers, you know, as Susan pointed out. So that's what we're hoping. That's what we're hoping for. Ryan, I think you were next.
Oh, thanks. I was wondering, to bring it back to Steve Bannon. I remember he said, he has this quote like, you know, the Democrats don't matter. The real opposition is the media, and the way to deal with the media is to flood the zone with crap, right? I was wondering if you can kind of talk about, it seems like Republicans increasingly over the years have just seemed to reject like fundamental truths about our world, right? And I was wondering if you could talk about how, if there's been a shift in how you've approached covering Republicans, the Republican Party specifically, especially in these past like few years. You know, do you treat them differently? Do you approach stories with them differently? And then my second question is, I was wondering if you could give us some kind of ballpark on how often you're texting and reaching out and talking to your most trusted sources.
So let me talk about the first question first. You know, I think there's been a big shift, not how, speaking for myself, and for, this is something I think is not limited to myself, but I think there's been a change in how we approach things we think are untrue, or things we know are untrue. And I actually, this came to a head a couple years ago with the birthers in Obama. And when there first began to be this campaign to say Obama wasn't born in the United States and therefore not legitimately elected president, we had a discussion about whether we should write about it, because were we spreading a lie by covering it, right? And what we discovered was that people were finding out about it even if we didn't cover it. But so therefore we had an obligation to cover it, to point out that it wasn't true. And the Obama people were not thrilled about coverage of this because, you know, they felt it was giving fuel to the untruth. But we became at that point more aggressive about pushing back against the allegation that he was born in Kenya, which was fervently repeated to me by my brother's girlfriend at the time, caused a big family scene, and I stormed out of the house. So, but even in more general coverage, I think we became more aggressive about pushing back. And as the misinformation became more mainstream, so that you could be covering somebody like a senator or a presidential candidate who was repeating untruths, we became more aggressive about not repeating an untruth in a headline without a pushback, not repeating a headline in a lead without a pushback, not posting a tweet that repeated an untruth without a pushback, because we don't want to let it stand in any form. And they developed this strategy called a truth sandwich. Do you know what a truth sandwich is? Okay, a truth sandwich is great. It's President Obama was born in Hawaii. Second, so that's the bread. And then the meat is so-and-so asserted he was born in Kenya, is not legitimately elected. And then the other piece of bread, but that is untrue. He's released his birth certificate that shows he was born. So you smash the untruth between two slices of true bread so that it doesn't get more currency. So no one can read just the headline or the lead and be left with an untruth. And that leads to sometimes not very elegant writing, but it leads to more defensible writing. And that is definitely a response to covering people who ought to be saying things you can trust, but who aren't. And that's been more Republicans than Democrats lately, but in fact, it's not a Republican strategy. It is a covering mistruth strategy. Who are you working for?
I'm with the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, which is the statewide newspaper in Arkansas. And so the congressional delegation I cover is all Republican, and the state it's a very heavily Republican state. And so that's something that I'm trying to figure out how to navigate, where it seems like so much of the statements that I hear, and so much of the rhetoric that is out there is really escalated, and it's really high wire. But a lot of it is filled with half truths, myths, truths, sometimes just straight out falsehoods. And it's it seems like that one other person mentioned this, that it just seems like a very highly polarized time. I mean, it is, but it's having to navigate those issues is really tough. And how do we create a true sandwich in every single story?
Well, we've decided
yeah.
you have to have a truth sandwich every time it comes around.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
like how do we push back against leaving the impression with anybody that what this untruth is true. By the way, one of my kids was an intern at that paper. He had a wonderful summer there. He learned, he grew up in DC. He learned a lot by working in Arkansas that summer. I don't know, it's interesting because in Arkansas, you've got some people who are pretty far out there in the Republican Party, but the governor has been, what are you rolling your eyes?
Well, no, it's interesting to know that you say that, because you're right on. He's like very this Bush Republican who, sees this Republican Party that he built over the last 3 decades, turning more to the right into something he doesn't like and doesn't see a future in. And so that's an interesting dynamic that's playing out right now.
Yeah. And in terms of, you ask about how often I'm trying to talk to sources.
Yeah, texting them every day, or you calling them?
Well, it depends. Like if there's a breaking story, like I was covering Obamacare, right? The passage. And at that point, I was trying to touch base with sources, like things were happening, I had particularly one absolutely golden source who I should offer to put his children through college, who I would talk to. He would call me in the middle of the night with tips and stuff. But now I'm working on this book. So I'm mostly touching base every day with people who knew Barbara Walters, which is, it's like my focus is I'm still the Washington Bureau Chief, but I'm also working on this book. So I'm not covering a beat at the moment, except for Barbara Walters as a beat. But when I was covering a beat, I would try to, on a breaking story, be touching base with the people I trusted. I was constantly trying to set up lunches. This has been hard with COVID, but trying to set up lunches or drinks or coffee or breakfast with people I thought who might be helpful. Going to any event I could, like any press conference, I could, even press conferences I didn't need to go to try to develop sources, and also just to let my face get out there. Well, another thing I did when now I'm, elderly grizzled reporter, but when I was a young reporter starting out, I would not only go to news conferences that I didn't need to go to, but I would sit in the front and I would ask a question. Like, because you never know, the person who's giving the news conference or the PR person who's watching it might be somebody who'd be a great source. So I wanted them to remember me. And I did that partly because often I was the only woman in the room too, and I wanted to make the point that women could ask questions. So I would advise doing that. It's like, it didn't pay off often in terms of that day's story, but it often paid off in terms of the long-term development of sources for that beat.
Yeah, I would like to just kind of hear and learn more about sort of your reporting process, like whether it's pre-reporting, your outlining, your pitching, things like that. I would just love to hear more about your process when you're attacking a big story.
Yeah, that's great. And then one thing I do now is to go after big interviews as often as I can. Mark, where are you working now?
The Washington Bureau of the New York Times.
Well, that seems pretty classy. So lots of Harvard grads there.
Yeah, I'm not one of them. I went to HBCU.
Yeah. Here's a lesson I learned when I was in college. I was the editor of the college paper, and it was a year of the Senate. I went to Northwestern, as I acknowledged before, and there was a Senate election there with Chuck Percy, who was this big name, old line Republican senator running for re-election against Roman Puczynski, who was a hack from the Daily Machine. Okay, because they threw him up as, chum, because no one was going to beat Chuck Percy. And because this was during the Vietnam War, and we had one of the reporters on the staff do some research on who we should endorse in the Senate race. And he came back having found that Chuck Percy would come on campus and talk like a liberal and then go back to Washington and vote like a conservative. And he would come on campus and be all anti-war, but he would go back to Washington, and that's not how he voted. And so we endorsed Roman Puczynski. And so I'm in the next day, I'm in the newsroom pretty late, and in walks this huge entourage of men in suits being led by Chuck Percy, who, as it turned out, was on campus to speak to a class or meet with donors or I don't know what. And he was enraged about this editorial that we had written. And the reason I later found out he was enraged was because he had a TV ad he was running statewide that said, every newspaper in Illinois that has endorsed a candidate has endorsed me. And because we endorsed Roman Puczynski, he had to take down this TV ad, which is why he cared, right? And so Senator Percy said to me in this confrontation in the newsroom, I cannot believe, he said this in more cultured tones, but I can't mimic him. I can't believe that you would make an endorsement like this and not allow me to speak to the editorial board, which overstated our editorial process. And I said, Senator, it never occurred to us that you would speak to our editorial board. And you're right, I wish we had asked to speak to you. And the lesson I took from that experience was that you'll never get an interview you don't ask for. And since then, I've tried to, anytime there's somebody I want to interview, I try to at least make a pitch for an interview because sometimes you get it, sometimes even surprisingly you get it. So that's a piece of advice. You never, it's like with politicians, you don't know what strategy they might have or what tactical thing they might have that maybe you're the perfect fit for an interview, even if you're not the obvious person. So one thing about getting big interviews is to just go after them. So how do you prepare? How do you prepare for interviews and stuff? What's your process, Mark?
Just trying to do some pre-reporting and write out some questions just to ask. Really don't stick to all of them. Just trying to, I obviously let the interview dictate itself, but try and do some pre-reporting ahead of time to just go in prepared and try and collect some documents and stuff, and at least have them in front of me or have it highlighted, just so I can, if they say something, and especially an untruth, I at least have it documented right in front of me, like a quick reference and things like that. So that's how I try and get prepared.
Yeah, I think preparation, especially for big interviews, for people who get interviewed a lot, is really important to read all the other interviews they've done, to the degree possible. Sometimes things happen on the fly, but to the degree possible, read all the interviews that they've done, and also think through how you could make news. So one thing we do before presidential interviews, which are kind of their own thing, because you usually only get 15 or 20 minutes, because presidents get interviewed all the time, and they would be happy to give you their talking points. They've said 100 times. So before presidential so I've interviewed 10 presidents. Not all of them while they were in office, but at some point. And with presidents, I try to think through what is the news I might be able to get and how could I get it? And I think of it almost as a performance, that if I ask this question, maybe he'll go there and then I can follow up with this, or maybe he'll go here and here would be the smart follow-up. I try to think through how would since the conversation is not going to be very long, how can I make it productive and suit my purposes, not his? I started doing that after the first president I interviewed, who was Ronald Reagan. And I came out of that interview very impressed that I'd been in the Oval Office, but without a shred of news. And I decided at that point that in the future, I would try to interview presidents and actually get some news.
Like a chess game.
Yeah.
Joseph.
My question, Susan, I guess is, you know, on my beat, I've noticed that, you know, I have to deal with some of Trump's misstatements, falsehoods, and straight up lies all the time on economic policy. You know, like when he was campaigning for re-election, he would say things like he built the greatest economy in the world, he slashed national debt, all these sorts of things. And you know, I feel like we're all gonna have to grapple with the possibility he could run again, and we're gonna have to run into like the same barrage of just falsehoods. So I'm guessing what I want to hear is, I guess I want to get your perspective on, is there anything you would do differently in covering the Trump administration during those first 4 years? And if so, what would you change?
Yeah. Joseph, I feel like I've seen your name someplace. Where are you working?
I'm at Business Insider. I'm their senior economic policy reporter. I'm running around chasing mansion. That's basically my job nowadays.
Maybe
Well,
that's
yeah.
because you have like a distinctive last name. So I thought I must have. Did you have a big scoop in the last couple days?
I basically confirmed yesterday that Manchin pulled his BBB offer from the table.
So I saw that it was like in a tweet or something. Anyway, I saw it and I thought, well, that's really interesting and very bad news for the White House. And I've never heard of that reporter who has the interesting last name. So you're already famous.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And that's actually the point of my last name. I actually kind of wanted to be distinctive, even though it's like very foreign sounding, but I actually kind of switched it a little bit for my byline.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my last name is Page, so that hasn't worked for me. So, yeah, you know, Trump was hard to cover as president. Here's the thing. Trump was in some ways very easy to cover as president because he talked all the time. The whole place leaked. You always knew what was going through his head because whatever went through his head, he would then say out loud, right? So we had a window into the president's head that the press has never had before in our history. So that in that way, it was useful. That was good. But a lot of what he said, as you said, wasn't true or wasn't in context or was menacing the institutions of democracy. So we had to figure out how to cover that. The thing I would do most different in covering Trump is not the Trump side of it, it's the voter side of it. Because believe me, in retrospect, I understand exactly what happened in 2016. So why didn't I see it at the time? And that is what I would like a do-over on.
Well, just a quick follow-up, like for example, when it comes to, you know, I guess when it comes to like the relationship that the media should have with a president who doesn't really respect the institution, do you think that the media should be kind of combative or just kind of stay and just hold him account when possible, or do you think it should be more combative? I guess that'd be my last follow-up.
Well, I think one should always be respectful to everybody, and especially to the president, because you're being respectful not just to the person who holds the job, but to the office itself, right? So I just think that is an important thing to do. I don't think I think our fundamental obligation in covering the president is to hold him accountable. That is like our main job. So we should definitely do that. But I don't know that requires being combative. I'm not sure that's the goal. I think even if you're pushing back hard, you can do it in a way that is fact-based and respectful. And that's also more likely to convince a broad spectrum of people that what you're saying isn't just because you're against him. But Trump was challenging in many ways. And, you know, I think every sign is that he's going to run again. And that if he runs again, I think it is likely he gets the nomination. So this is not exactly something we're not going to face again.
Yeah. Meryl and then Ben, and can you all say where you're working from?
Hey, I work at the Washington Post, and I really appreciate you talking to us. I was really interested in hearing more about your sourcing, since you were talking about that earlier, how you keep up with sources, specifically like with your biographer work. you know, just like understanding a web of people that one person has known, you know, throughout time. I'm wondering, how do you figure out who you want to talk to? Sorry if it's loud, it's my computer. Who do you talk to, and like who's in telling?
Meryl, I think you sort of broke up, but I think you're asking, how do you figure out who you want to talk to and whether they're telling the truth? Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure if you caught the part where I was asking about for the books that you've been writing, like the work as a biographer, when you're telling one person's story, like who you reach out to like better understand that one person.
Right. So so for the Pelosi book, the Pelosi biography I did that came out last April, and the paperback, by the way, out March 22nd, if you're looking for like Mother's Day gifts. The first person I wanted to try to talk to was her. And I signed the contract to do the book without having any agreement with her that she would talk to me. In fact, I don't know that she knew I was going to do that. And the reason I did that with both those books, that and the Barbara Bush books. I did that because I thought if I went to her and said, I'm thinking about doing a biography of you, will you let me interview you? And she said no, that I might chicken out. And I was worried if I went to her and said, I'm thinking about writing a biography of you, will you talk to me? And she said yes, that she would think she had some sway over what I wrote. And I didn't want to do a authorized biography. I wanted to do a work of journalism. So anyway, I signed a contract, and then I went and asked for an interview, and I'd interviewed her over the years for USA Today and for Newsday. And fortunately, she gave me one interview and then another, and I ended up with 11 interviews, 10 interviews for the hardback and 11 with the paperback. So that was the starting point. But I then interviewed 150 other people about Pelosi, and that included people close to her, like her husband and one of her good high school friends and women she went to college with, and also people she had worked with and people who had worked against her, and just anybody I could think of who might have a perspective. And one of the reasons I've liked doing books is you've got the luxury of time, so you can talk to 150 people. And it gives you a good sense of who's telling the truth and who's not, because you have like multiple sources on almost everything, on almost every event that happens. So, so that's how. And we actually, in working a beat, also it's the same effort of trying to talk to anybody. When I was working a beat, I would try to talk to anybody who was willing to talk to me, and then try to assess over time who was trustworthy and who was not, and who told it straight and who didn't. And it's just like you gotta. Like, especially early on a beat, I would really over report. Like I would have the day's story, but I would interview 3 more people, not because I needed them, but because I thought it was a long-term investment. And I think that's a smart thing to do. I think it's smart to over report. Also, once in a while, the last call you make will tell you something you didn't know and make your story better. So how's your experience been in trying to get people to talk to you? Meryl, has that worked pretty well?
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that you interviewed 150 people for Pelosi's book. I feel like it's been really helpful to have numbers with the number of people you talk to. I cover overdoses a lot, so I interview people who like lost loved ones to overdoses anytime I can, and just like hear their life story, what happened, how did they die, and it just illuminates kind of like the who behind this crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Thanks for doing this. I work for ABC News in Washington. I'm currently in my apartment on the Hill right now, not at the Capitol, but I usually work at the Capitol. And this kind of dovetails with some of the other advice and tips that you gave earlier, but is there something that you know now, or a practice you have now that you wish you knew earlier in your career, or some, was there a certain scoop that you got or that you just missed, that you learned something from that has stuck with you, or any advice from an experience like that you'd be willing to share? Thank you.
Yeah. I I think my 4 tips were like the distillation of lessons I've learned. I gotta say, I finish every campaign thinking, why didn't I see that? I mean, not just 2016, thinking, why didn't I see that? Why didn't I pursue that string? How could I have gotten that wrong? Not factually wrong, but my pitch was wrong. I didn't understand what was really going on. You know, I do a lot of, it's not that I'm full of regret. It's that I always feel like, gee, I should have been smarter, and why don't I try to be smarter next time? So by that standard, I should be really smart now, but apparently not entirely. I don't know. There's also, you know, there's an advantage having been around and covered stuff for a while. There's an advantage to not. There's an advantage to being a fresh look at a situation or a topic or a campaign or a political party. I mean, there's an advantage to not being the person who's covered 11 campaigns, but be the person covering your first campaign. So has your ABC, of course, home of Barbara Walters, just pointing out. Has your experience there been good?
Know her, unfortunately, so I can't,
Yes.
I can't help with the book. Sorry.
Yeah. But has your experience working for ABC on the Hill been good?
No, it's been really good. I was lucky to sort of be in the right place at the right time. You know, you mentioned the restructuring that our industry has kind of been going through for a while. ABC went through a rejiggering of the Washington operation right after I got out of college, and was a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed intern / you know, desk assistant. So you know, from there I was lucky enough to get up to the Capitol, you know, right before Boehner resigned, and kind of it's been nonstop since then. But you know, I don't work with very many people who have been covering institutionally Washington or Congress for a long time. It's just not the kind of newsroom that we have. So appreciate the insights that you've shared with us. And obviously there are people, but you know, it's not the same as some of the other newsrooms represented here and in town. So thank you.
Susan, do we have time for a couple more?
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Sophia?
Hi, I'm currently at Axios, and I'm wondering what your advice for someone with free range, you know, access at both Congress and the White House, and as a fairly young person, newer to Washington. I'm currently mainly focused on Congress. I mean, this year we expect the focus to move from policy to campaigns, but soon Trump will run for president. And my guess is that the headlines will move from, you know, Schumer couldn't do this to Trump X or Trump Y. And at the same time, you know, I've been watching some issues that interest me and that I think will be more and more important, like cybersecurity, the erosion of democracy, and domestic extremism. And my question for you is, if you were in this position, where would you focus? What's your advice?
So Sophia, a great question. And let me talk about what I did when I was like a young reporter starting out, interested, thought I could cover a variety of different things and wanted to do everything I could. I was always willing to run toward this story, right? So once you have like 2 kids at home and you're going to virtual school, you will no longer be able to volunteer to drive to West Virginia to cover a Manchin rally, right? But now you can, right? You would be delighted. I remember when I was a young reporter at Newsday, my editor woke me up one night and said, "There's been a nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. Why don't you get there?" And so I said, "That sounds great." I went down and I packed a bag and I went in my car and I spent, a couple of weeks at 3 Mile Island. That's not something I would do today, right? But it's something it was possible for me to do then. And it pays off in big ways because you get to cover big stories. And you also get to demonstrate that you can cover big stories. And it takes advantage of the asset you have, because the asset you have is not decades of experience. The asset you have is energy and kind of ability in terms of your personal life to like run toward the fire.
Susan, thanks so much for doing this. I work for Kaiser Health News. And my question is, how do you get a source to trust you and to trust that you're the reporter to like share information with that might break a story, especially like when you are this younger reporter in DC that maybe doesn't have this reputation behind you yet? How do you do that? Especially for me, I find it's a little harder because I am at an outlet that's always not well recognized. So just wondering if you had any advice on that.
So for me, the way that worked was just to cover stories, right? So that you deal with them. You kind of can't do it in the abstract. You got to do it in the practice. And the more you do stories that your sources think are smart and fair, the more willing they're going to be sources for you. You know, like this, also the degree to which you can figure out why does it serve. One thing, when I was covering the White House for USA Today, it was not so hard to get people to call me back. When I covered the White House for Newsday, it was a little harder because, you know, it wasn't a national paper and people at the White House always have 100 reporters they could call back. I would try to figure out why a source should want to talk to me as opposed to somebody else. And you know, for instance, if they had a Long Island connection, I would definitely point that out or try to use that as an opportunity, or a New York issue, or you know, I would just try to figure out, why do you suit my purposes? How can I suit your purposes? And I think that that could be helpful for an outlet that is not the New York Times or the Washington Post. The other thing that I think is important to do is to acknowledge mistakes. Because, you know, we're all going to make mistakes, right? We're all human. And I've tried, it's easy to get defensive when you have an error, but I've tried very hard to acknowledge the error immediately and in a public way. And that, even if you've gotten something wrong, it's reassuring, I think, to a source that you're willing to like correct it and move on, as opposed to defend yourself on why, you know, like you think about the NPR story now. I mean, I think it's pretty clear Nina Totenberg wrote a story that wasn't really true, right? That Justice Roberts asked Gorsuch to wear a mask and he wouldn't, right? But you see them trying to like make it it's the meaning of the word ask, and it's suggest, but we don't know in what format. I mean, why not just say the story was written beyond where the sourcing was, and then try to put the onus, number one, that'd be the more straightforward thing for NPR to do. NPR, which is usually pretty straightforward about making corrections. And it also might put the onus on Justice Roberts and Gorsuch and Sotomayor to tell us what actually is going on, which would be very interesting to know. So anyway, I think those are the way you need to, I think you need to prove yourself as a person who's worth talking to because your stories are smart and fair. And you need to figure out, why should this person want to talk to me? And that's also, you know, something I do when I try to pitch big interviews. Why should this president or vice president or presidential candidate or big author want to talk to me? And I make that part of the appeal of agreeing to an interview.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you so much for this. This has been so valuable. And it's just great to hear all of your stories and learn from you. Yeah, so folks, I know this is not the same being on Zoom. If you wouldn't mind unmuting, and we can just give Susan a little round of applause.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great to be with you. Good luck with the program.